We've just finished a couple of days shooting out here in the Netherlands, but we drove here in our disco, right?
We did, yes.
And it strikes me, as you're finding right now, that we're having to drive on the right in our British car, which is right-hand drive.
Yeah.
Have you ever wondered why some countries drive on the left and some on the right?
Do you know what, Drew? Yes, I have.
Yeah, and I never knew. I always, obviously Britain drives on the left, and you think countries where it's had an influence drive on the left, but...
The colonies.
The colonies.
Yes.
But the majority of countries drive on the right. In fact, 65% of the world's population drives on the right.
Is it only 65%?
Only 65, mainly because India drives on the left. Before cars, before anything like that, the whole world passed on the left. Because going back to medieval times, that just made sense.
Oh, I think I know this.
Yeah, where people are crossing each other, you think of, you might have your sword on your left-hand side, so you might want to fight someone, so you'd pass them on the left, so your sword would be on the right. Or if you're just trying to pass someone who's also wearing a sword on their left, you'd pass on the left so your swords don't clash.
Scabbards didn't clash.
Scabbards don't clash. So why did it change? Well, I did some digging, and apparently in the 1700s it became more popular in America and in France in particular, with industry becoming larger and stuff that being transported needed more horses, for them to have an array of 4 horses as opposed to just one. Now, if you've got 4 horses and there isn't a particular harness or somewhere to sit, you would sit on the back left horse, which would keep your right hand free for a riding whip.
Mounting a horse, I believe, is easier from the left-hand side if you are
Yes.
handed, footed, whatever. So that would kind of, which was equally the reason why they rode a single horse on the left-hand side, because you wanted to mount from the curb, effectively.
Yeah, that started to become the trend. So the United States thereafter pretty much stayed passing on the right, because that meant you were on the left-hand side and you could judge your distance to oncoming traffic more. And in France, more peasant traffic tended to want to go on the right as well. But the upper classes, the bourgeoisie, they still like to travel on the left, and they would have to push over peasants onto the right. Come the French Revolution,
didn't want to stand out so much.
They didn't want to stand out so much, so they just kind of went over to the right. And by the time Napoleon came around, it was fully set in that the French would pass on the right. Countries like Austria, which were split down the middle in terms of what was taken over by Napoleon, half passed on the left and half passed on the right. And they would have to put signs outside of towns so people would know what side to pass on. But you're talking very slow moving traffic at this point, not a problem.
Didn't Spain until like the 1930s?
Yeah, they only unified in the 1920s. Canada didn't unify its entire country to driving on the right until 1947. Obviously, that has French influence, which wanted to drive on the right, and it had British influence, which wanted to drive on the left. By now, the whole world is kind of settling down, but some countries wanted to shift. The most notable one was Sweden. They were driving on the left after the Second World War and had been forever, but all the countries in Europe driving on the right, and they wanted to unify with the rest of Europe. It just made more sense, both to be able to buy cars and export cars into Europe.
Yeah.
So Sweden had this referendum in 1955 where the government asked, should we move to driving on the right? And 82% of the population said, no, let's stay driving on the left. So the government ignored them. It took a while. Obviously, you can't switch overnight. That referendum was in 1955. They formally announced, I believe, in 1963 that they were going to do it. And in 1967, they had H-Day. I think it was the 3rd of September, 1967.
H-Day. There should be an H-Day.
H-Day.
Every year, I think.
They had a logo.
H-Day.
A logo with an H with a kind of a going up the left and coming up the right. The word for driving on the right in Swedish begins with an H. I think that's where it comes from. The change was at 5 a.m. They banned driving a couple of hours before and a couple of hours after. And tried to make sure that all the signs were changed in time, but it was absolute chaos. Like
they imposed the
complete
speed limit
chaos
as well, didn't they?
Yeah, ultra low speed limit just to get started. But even then, you look at pictures of Stockholm in the mid-morning of that day, and there are cars everywhere, and just basically people going, A bunch of other countries did it as well. Belize shifted from the left to the right, Ghana, Nigeria, Iceland. But there's one exception to that list, and that's Samoa. Samoa is the only country in the world to have shifted from driving on the right to driving on the left, because they were finding it too expensive to import cars from the US when New Zealand, Australia and Japan, so much closer, and they could bring in cheap cars from there. And Japan's quite interesting actually as an exception to the rule, because that obviously Japan drives on the left, but was never part of the British Empire. So it got formalized in Japan when the first major railway systems were being built, and that was with aid of the British. So they passed on the left there, and that just stuck. So now we're in a world where most of the countries of the world and most of the population drive on the right, and most of the major car producing nations produce left-hand drive cars to be driven on the right. But because of this hangover from medieval days and the British Empire, we still drive on the left, and it's unlikely that is ever going to change. It's not necessarily a satisfactory conclusion of it. I think the only time humanity will ever unify is when we completely destroy this planet and have to move to a new one, and we just all decide to drive on the same on planet X. But here's the question, what side do we pick?